On December 21, 1945, the most volatile partnership in military history reached a silent, tragic end. As General Dwight D. Eisenhower received a final message regarding the fate of George S. Patton, he was forced to confront a haunting paradox. How could the man who saved the Western Front be destroyed by a routine drive? Before the silence, there were 4 words that changed everything. Why did they make the Supreme Commander cry? The winter of 1944 did not arrive with a whisper. It arrived with the roar of 2,000 German artillery pieces, shattering the silence of the Ardennes forest. It was December 16th, and the German Wehrmacht had launched Operation Wacht am Rhein, a desperate final gamble to split the Allied lines and seize the vital port of Antwerp. Thick fog and heavy snow grounded the Allied air arm, turning the sky into a useless gray ceiling. On the ground, the situation was catastrophic. The 101st Airborne Division was rushed into the critical crossroads of Bastogne, only to be surrounded by the 5th Panzer Army under General Hasso von Manteuffel. Thousands of American paratroopers were trapped in a frozen circle of hell, outnumbered 5-1 and running dangerously low on ammunition and medical supplies. In the supreme headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force known as SHAEF, the atmosphere was thick with a tension that maps and pins could not describe. General Dwight D. Eisenhower sat at the center of this storm, weighing the lives of 10,000 men against the strategic collapse of the Western Front. He knew that the 101st Airborne was the cork in the bottle. If Bastogne fell, the German panzers would have a clear run to the Meuse River. According to declassified National Archive reports from the ETOUSA Records Group 338.3.1, the intelligence estimates were grim. The paratroopers had perhaps 4 days of life left before they were annihilated by the 7.5-centimeter KWK-40 guns of the German STU-G3 assault brigades. On December 19, 1944, Eisenhower summoned his top commanders to a cold, damp barracks in Verdun. The mood was funereal. Most of the generals present looked at the maps and saw only disaster. Eisenhower, however, stood before them and declared that the situation was an opportunity, not a catastrophe. He demanded to know how soon the German penetration could be countered. He turned to the one man who lived for the sting and clash of battle, the commander of the 3rd United States Army, General George S. Patton. Eisenhower asked the impossible. "George, how soon can you move 3 divisions to the north and attack the southern flank of the German offensive?" Patton did not hesitate. He did not consult a staff officer or look at a logistical chart. He leaned forward and said, "As soon as you're through with me, I can have 3 divisions moving in 48 hours. A collective gasp filled the room. To the other commanders, this was not just a boast. It was a physical impossibility. Patton was proposing to pivot an entire field army, nearly 250,000 men and thousands of vehicles, 90 degrees in the middle of a blizzard. They were currently engaged in heavy fighting to the east, and now Patton claimed he could disengage them, move them over 100 miles of icy roads, and launch a coordinated assault. Eisenhower was skeptical, as his own memoirs Crusade in Europe later revealed, but he saw the fire in Patton's eyes. He had no other choice. He gave the order. What followed was a masterpiece of logistical friction overcome by sheer force of will. Patton had already anticipated the move. Before he even left for the meeting at Verdun, he had instructed his staff to prepare 3 separate contingency plans. This was the "a genius for war" moment that historians still study today. Patton used a simple code word over a phone line to trigger the largest tactical shift of the war. The 4th Armored Division, the 26th Infantry, and the 81st Infantry Division began a relentless march through the white hell of the Ardennes. They were moving in columns, headlights blacked out, drivers struggling to maintain a 5-yard interval on roads that had been turned into skating rinks by the sleet. Inside the perimeter at Bastogne, the 101st Airborne was enduring a nightmare. Private memoirs from paratroopers, such as those preserved in the Veterans Breakfast Club archives, recount the sound of German Nebelwerfer rockets screaming through the trees. The men were frostbitten, their boots frozen to their feet, and their only defense against the German 2nd Panzer Division was grit and the occasional M1 Garand rifle. When the German commander, Heinrich von Luttwitz, sent a formal demand for surrender, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe gave the reply that would define the American fighting spirit: "Nuts!" But even nuts could not stop the lack of 75mm artillery shells. The Screaming Eagles were waiting for a miracle, and that miracle was a cloud-colored tank. The spearhead of Patton's relief force was the 4th Armored Division, specifically the 37th Tank Battalion led by Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams. They were facing the 5th Fallschirmjäger Division, elite German paratroopers who had dug into every village and crossroad. The fighting was house to house, a brutal grind through towns like Warnock and Bougainville. Patton was screaming over the radio for speed, his voice high-pitched and urgent, demanding they drive like hell. He knew that every hour wasted was an hour closer to the 101st's destruction. According to unit war diaries of the 4th Armored, the tanks were operating at reduced speeds due to mechanical fatigue, but they never stopped coming. The climax occurred on December 26, 1944. Lieutenant Charles Boggess was commanding a specialized tank known as the M4A302 Jumbo Sherman, nicknamed Cobra King. This 42-ton beast featured 4 inches of frontal armor, designed specifically to absorb the 88mm rounds of the German anti-tank guns. Boggess looked it through his periscope at the village of Assenois. He knew the road north was the only way into the heart of the siege. He didn't wait for a formal artillery barrage to finish. He ordered his driver to floor it. Cobra King roared forward, followed by a small column of Shermans and half-tracks, smashing through the German lines in a daring dash that bypassed enemy strongpoints. At 1650 hours, the lead tanks of the 4th Armored Division made contact with the 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion of the 101st. The siege was broken. The handshake between Lieutenant Boggess and Lieutenant Dwayne Webster of the 101st symbolized a turning point that shattered the German offensive's momentum. Back at SHAEF headquarters, Eisenhower was pacing his office, his face a mask of exhaustion and anxiety. He had been drafting condolence letters to the families of the men he thought were doomed. Then the phone rang. It was Patton. Through the crackle of the long-distance line, Patton spoke the 4 words that changed everything. "We're through to Bastogne." Those who were in the room with Eisenhower reported that the Supreme Commander didn't just smile. His eyes welled with tears. The weight of tens of thousands of lives had been lifted by the one general he found most difficult to manage, yet most impossible to replace. This was the moment Eisenhower realized that genius, however abrasive, was worth every diplomatic headache when it delivered a miracle. But the relief of Bastogne was only the beginning of a final bitter chapter. While the world celebrated Patton as a hero, the seeds of his downfall were being sown in the very soil he had liberated. Eisenhower's relief was soon replaced by the realization that the war was shifting from a struggle of tactics to a struggle of politics. Patton, a man built for the chaos of the battlefield, was entirely unsuited for the delicate peace that followed. In the months that followed, the relationship would sour over the management of post-war Germany and the implementation of denazification. In the spring of 1945, as the Third Army raced across Germany, Patton's ego began to clash with the reality of a world that no longer needed a warlord. He crossed the Rhine at Oppenheim on March 22nd, 2 days before the meticulously planned Operation Plunder. He called Eisenhower again, this time with a boast, "I'm across the Rhine." But Eisenhower's reaction was different. He was already thinking about the Russians, about the partition of Europe, and about the paper army he would eventually have to give Patton to keep him out of trouble. By late 1945, Patton had been kicked upstairs to the 15th Army, a headquarters that existed mainly on paper to write the history of the campaign. He was bitter, writing to his wife Beatrice that he felt crucified by the press and abandoned by Eisenhower. On December 9, 1945, he went for a simple hunting trip near Mannheim. It was supposed to be a day of rest. Instead, a 2.5-ton GMC truck made a left turn into the path of his Cadillac. Patton was thrown forward, his head striking the clock on the partition of the car. He was conscious but paralyzed from the neck down. His first words to his chief of staff, Hap Gay, were a chilling assessment of his own condition. "I think I'm paralyzed." He was taken to the 131st Station Hospital in Heidelberg, where for 12 days the man who had commanded 500,000 soldiers was confined to a bed, unable to move his fingers. Eisenhower, now in Washington as chief of staff, received regular updates. The man who had cried at Patton's success was now mourning his slow, agonizing decline. On December 21, 1945, the 4 stars of George S. Patton went out forever. He died in his sleep, a victim of a pulmonary edema. When Eisenhower heard the news, he didn't issue a grand, heroic eulogy immediately. Instead, he sat in his office and looked at a photo of his old friend. In his private diary, he reflected on the loneliness of command and the burden of having to restrain the very people you need to win. The 4 words of 1944 were a memory, replaced by the finality of a friend's death. But what was the secret that Eisenhower kept until 1965? What was the truth about the 4 words that history almost forgot? While the relief of Bastogne had secured George S. Patton's place as a tactical legend, the victory did little to heal the widening fracture between him and the Supreme Commander. Dwight D. Eisenhower was no longer just a general. He was the architect of a new world order, balancing the demands of Roosevelt, Churchill, and a suspicious Joseph Stalin. Patton, meanwhile, remained a creature of the 19th century battlefield, a man who believed that war was a magnificent competition and that his destiny was to die in its final charge. But history had a different, more agonizing end in mind. By March 1945, the Allied steamroller had reached the final barrier of the Third Reich, the Rhine River. For months, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery had been preparing Operation Plunder, a massive methodical crossing involving thousands of guns and an airborne armada. But Patton viewed Montgomery's caution with a contempt that bordered on the visceral. He didn't want a planned crossing, he wanted a predatory one. On the night of March 22, 1945, without a single artillery shell fired in preparation, the 5th Infantry Division of Patton's Third Army slipped across the Rhine at Oppenheim. The next morning, the telephone at SHAEF headquarters rang once again. Eisenhower picked up the receiver to hear a triumphant Patton. "I'm across, Ike," he reportedly said. "I've just pissed in the Rhine." These were 4 words of a different sort, an announcement of an impossible feat achieved 2 days before Montgomery's grand spectacle was set to begin. According to declassified military communications, Eisenhower's reaction was a complex mix of professional gratitude and diplomatic dread. He knew he would now have to explain to a furious Churchill and a humiliated Montgomery how a secondary effort had stolen the headlines of the final campaign. This was the Patton paradox. He was the only man who could win the war quickly, and the only man who could lose the peace just as fast. The drive into the heart of Germany revealed horrors that would forever change Eisenhower's perspective on the mission. On April 12, 1945, Eisenhower, accompanied by Patton and Omar Bradley, visited the newly liberated Ohrdruf subcamp, part of the Buchenwald complex. Patton, the man who had seen the carnage of a dozen battlefields, found himself physically ill, unable to enter some of the barracks. Eisenhower, however, forced himself to see every detail. "The things I saw beggar description," Eisenhower wrote to General George Marshall. He realized then that the war was not just about lines on a map, but about a fundamental struggle between civilization and a brutality that the English language didn't even have words for. This moral awakening in Eisenhower created a new friction with Patton. While Eisenhower became obsessed with the denazification of Germany and the absolute purging of the Nazi Party, Patton took a more pragmatic view that shocked his superiors. As the military governor of Bavaria, Patton argued that the complete removal of all Nazi officials would lead to administrative collapse. During a press conference on September 22, 1945, he made the disastrous analogy that this Nazi question is very much like a Democratic and Republican election fight. When the reports reached Frankfurt, Eisenhower was aghast. The Supreme Commander, who had protected Patton through slapping scandals and verbal outbursts, finally reached his breaking point. On September 28, 1945, Eisenhower summoned Patton to Frankfurt for a 2-hour meeting that would define the end of Patton's combat career. Witnesses described Eisenhower as more excited than I have ever seen him. He was no longer the forgiving friend. He was the commander-in-chief of an occupation force. He informed Patton that he was being relieved of his command of the Third Army and his role as governor. He was being kicked upstairs to the 15th Army, a paper army with a staff of only 367 officers, tasked with writing a history of the war. To Patton, this was a crucifixion. He felt he was being silenced by the very men he had saved at Bastogne. Patton's final days with the Third Army were a study in tragic dignity. On October 7, 1945, he stood before his troops to give a farewell address. He hid his inward fury behind a high-pitched, squeaky voice that had once commanded 1,000,000 men. "All good things must come to an end," he told them. As he walked off the platform, tears were streaming down his face. Not the tears of relief Eisenhower had shed in 1944, but the tears of a warrior who realized the world no longer had a place for him. He wrote in his diary that he felt his luck had run out. He began telling his daughters that he wouldn't live to see America again. December 9, 1945 began as a rare moment of peace. Patton and his chief of staff, Major General Hobart Hap Gay, were driving toward the Rhine for a pheasant hunting trip. Patton was sitting in the back of his 1938 Cadillac Series 75 limousine, chauffeured by Corporal Horace Woodring. As they drove through the industrial outskirts of Mannheim, Patton was ironically commenting on the litter of war piled up on the roadside, burnt-out tanks and shattered trucks he had helped destroy. He was relaxed, his ivory-handled revolver stowed away, unaware that a 2.5-ton GMC truck was about to change history. At an intersection in Mannheim-Kuffertal, the driver of the GMC truck, Technical Sergeant Robert L. Thompson, made a sudden, unsignaled left turn. The impact was not high speed, but it was catastrophic for the man in the back seat. While Hap Gay and the drivers suffered only minor bruises, Patton was thrown forward. His head struck the metal clock in the glass partition behind the driver's seat. The force of the impact snapped his neck, fracturing the third and fourth cervical vertebrae. In an instant, the man who had survived German 88mm shells and strafing Messerschmitts was reduced to a shattered frame. The scene at the accident site was surreal. Patton remained conscious, but as Hap Gay tried to lift him, the general spoke his first words since the crash. "I think I'm paralyzed." He then asked Gay to rub his fingers, and when he felt nothing, he barked, "Go ahead, Hap, work my fingers." According to medical reports from the 131st Station Hospital in Heidelberg, Patton was admitted at 12:45 hours. The diagnosis was a broken neck and spinal cord injury. For a man of Patton's spirit, the prospect of being enthroned in a bed was a fate worse than any battlefield death. For 12 days, Patton fought a battle he could not win. His wife Beatrice flew from the United States, staying by his bedside in a small room in Heidelberg. Eisenhower, now in Washington, D.C., was receiving daily cables on the general's condition. The Supreme Commander felt a warm feeling in his heart for his old friend, but also a profound sadness. He knew the irony of Patton's end. Patton himself murmured to his doctors, "This is a hell of a way to die." He was a man of the sword, yet he was being taken by a fender bender. On December 21, 1945, the end came. Patton died in his sleep from a pulmonary edema and heart failure. The news hit the world like a second ending to the war. Eisenhower, who had once written savage letters to Patton, now issued a formal statement of mourning that emphasized the unquestioned value of Patton as an assault commander. But privately, Eisenhower's reflections were deeper. He knew that Patton's death had spared the general from a long, bitter retirement of political controversy and potential court-martials. In a way, the work of God that Patton often spoke of had taken him before his legend could be further tarnished. Patton was buried on Christmas Eve, 1944, exactly 1 year after the darkest days of the siege of Bastogne. Per his own request to be buried where his men fell, he was laid to rest at the Luxembourg American Cemetery and Memorial. Thousands of soldiers stood in the freezing rain to watch the casket of old blood and guts pass by. Eisenhower was unable to attend the funeral due to his duties in Washington, but the bond between the two remained a haunting presence in his life. He would later tell his son, John Eisenhower, that managing Patton was the most difficult task of the war, but one he would do again in a heartbeat. In September 1946, Eisenhower finally made a private pilgrimage to Patton's grave in Luxembourg. Archival footage from the National Archives, identifier 20017, shows the Supreme Commander debarking from a staff car and walking slowly to a simple white cross among thousands of others. He removed his hat and placed a wreath of flowers. For several minutes, the man who would become President of the United States stood in silence. He was no longer the Supreme Commander, and Patton was no longer the difficult subordinate. They were just two old friends from Camp Meade, survivors of a conflict that had consumed 60 million lives. The ultimate testament to this relationship came in a 1965 interview, 4 years before Eisenhower's own death. When asked to evaluate the generals of World War II, Eisenhower didn't mention Montgomery or Bradley first. He spoke of Patton. He admitted that while Patton's personality had been nightmarish for the junior officers and the diplomatic corps, his operational brilliance had saved an entire division from annihilation at Bastogne. George was the only one who could do it, Eisenhower admitted. He promised, and he delivered. Those four words, he promised and he delivered, were the final resolution to the tears shed in 1944. Today, the names Patton and Eisenhower remain inextricably linked. One was the shield, the other the sword. One was the statesman, the other the storm. The four words that changed everything were through to Bastogne, represent more than a tactical success. They represent the moment a commander realized that genius, however flawed, is the only thing that can achieve the impossible. As we look back on the snows of 1944 and the rain of 1945, we are reminded that history is not made by perfect men, but by difficult men who refuse to accept defeat. If Patton had lived to lead the post-war army, do you think his aggressive stance against the Soviets would have changed the course of the Cold War? Or was Eisenhower right to restrain him? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell.